Professor Fohlin has published 2 books and numerous academic papers in leading journals. She has received many awards and grants, all testifying to the quality of her scholarship. Dr. Fohlin has regular media appearances, most recently on NPR. Dr. Rubin is an Emory economics professor emeritus who held Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor for 15 years. Dr. Rubin has written extensively in areas of economic regulation, law and economics, and applied microeconomics. His 7th book, titled A Student's Guide to Socialism, came out recently. Dr. Rubin's career has been quite prolific, spanning academia, private sector, and the government, including the White House, where he held a senior position on the President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. Before I leave the microphone to Dr. Mialon, I would like to thank our 3 distinguished colleagues. I would also like to thank Ms. Elizabeth Eichinger, who has managed all the logistical arrangements for this event. Thank you and enjoy.
Good evening. I am Hugo Miero from the Economics Department of Emory University in the beautiful city of Atlanta, Georgia. I welcome you to a debate on the economic policies of the 2020 presidential candidates. Professor Deshbash and I have designed the format and chosen the questions. Professor Rubin will be representing President Trump's side, and Professor Fohlin, Vice President Biden's side. I have shared the questions with our experts beforehand. Both experts have agreed to the debate rules. I will pose a question from one side, and the expert on that side will have 2 minutes uninterrupted to respond, which may be followed by 1 minute uninterrupted to the expert on the other side for rebuttal. We have asked both experts to carefully clear their room of flies and other interested insects, and of course, to stay within their time limits. So let's get started. The first question is for Professor Rubin. How do you assess President Trump's record on the economy? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted. Turn on your mic, Paul. You have to turn on your mic.
Take the time before the COVID virus, Trump had quite a remarkable record on the economy. He came in to an economy that was pulling out of a recession, but he improved the economy much more beyond that, which is why I think 56% of the people, of the voters, prefer Trump on the economy. He's done a good job. During that time, unemployment was down lower than it's been since anyone can remember, 3.5%. For minorities, it was 5.5%. Wages were going up. Stock market was up. And not only did the economy do well, but almost every year really, it did better than the Federal Reserve had predicted. So have the Federal Reserve making predictions about the economy, that's what you might expect to happen. If the economy does better than that, that's a sign that something correct going on. So without the virus, I have no doubt that President Trump would have been easily reelected because the economy was doing so well. And whatever else people think of him, the economy is a very important issue to most voters, and he was doing extremely well. Now the virus, to some, is a more important issue, but if the economy were the issue again, President Trump would easily be reelected because he had done such a good job, and people would expect him to continue to do a good job, and there's no reason why he would not continue in that vein.
You have another 30 seconds if you want to elaborate. You give
Now, I'll save that for later.
Okay. So next question for Professor Fohlin, an analogous one. What is Vice President Biden and Democrats' view of the economy under President Trump? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted. You have to unmute your mic, Caroline.
Thank you, Hugo. So I wanted to share a little bit of kind of a, can you see my screen share?
We can see it.
Okay. So what that shows you is the economic growth since 2009. And so I guess what I would point out is that until 2020, the Trump administration had done actually little to promote economic growth, despite significant tax cuts and reduction in environmental and a lot of other regulations on corporations. The Trump administration's policies increased income and wealth inequality because the tax cut mostly benefited large corporations and wealthy individuals. At the same time, the Trump trade war has cost consumers and American producers about $50 billion in the form of tariff-induced price increases, especially on goods from China. It has also instigated retaliatory tariffs against US corporations, causing US exports to suffer and fall sharply. In 2020, there's widespread thinking that the coronavirus pandemic could have been handled better by the Trump administration, and it has caused tens of thousands of needless deaths. And that actually has prevented the US economy from fully reopening. Failing to continue the stimulus payments that were put out earlier in the late spring and unemployment supplements that ended in July has actually stymied the rebound that started in the wake of the first round of payments over the summer. And you can see that in the graph. Even before the pandemic, the budget deficit and the national debt have mushroomed under the Trump administration. As of October 2020, the national debt reached a new high of $27 trillion, an increase of almost 36% since the start of the Trump administration. Historically, at least since World War II, GDP, business investment, real wages, and stock prices actually have grown faster under Democratic presidents than under Republican presidents. The Trump administration follows the same historical pattern. A Biden administration would improve conditions for workers and stimulate new investment, especially in green technology, and thereby spur economic growth and raise wages. And so do I have any more time to elaborate?
No, your 2 minutes is up.
Okay, I just wanted to show the historical data. Can you see that? I just thought that was an interesting graph. This is real GDP growth, and it cut the side on the right cuts off the Great Recession and the coronavirus. And then this is stocks real total return. So even if you're a stock investor, overall over the post-World War II era, Democratic administrations have actually won you bigger gains in the stock market too.
Thank you. Then the next question is for Professor Rubin. So critics argue that President Trump's 2017 income and corporate tax cuts benefit mainly the rich and big companies that pay little in tax anyway, leading to stock buybacks rather than the promised investment. Agree or disagree, and why? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
Well, the tax cuts were actually across the board, so everyone benefited at least somewhat. Of course, the rich pay much more in taxes, more than their proportionate share. So if you have a even tax cut or a proportional tax cut, the rich are going to get more of it than the non-rich. And in fact, the evidence is that the tax cut increased progressivity somewhat. So it really was not a regressive tax cut. Well, corporate taxes are a funny thing. Corporations pay the tax in the sense that they write the checks, but what really counts, as economists know, is the incidence of the tax. Who actually, prices change because of the tax, and the incidence question is who actually ends up paying the tax. Taxes paid by corporations are actually paid by stockholders, which includes people with 403Bs or retirement plans that own stock. Workers pay through lower wages. Consumers pay through higher prices. So to say that the tax cut benefits corporations is really not a very useful thing. There's some person involved in any tax cut. In fact, 2/3 of the stock is owned by institutional investors. 2/3 of the value of the stock market is owned by institutional investors, which includes retirement plans. So in that sense, 2/3 of the corporate tax reductions actually of the share that went to capital actually went to consumers as well. Stock buyback, people say it's a horrible thing. A stock buyback is just when the corporation says our investors could do better with the money we can do with it. So we'll return some capital to them by buying back their stocks. And that's actually an efficient way to move capital throughout the economy. It just says the capital that enables capital to move to its highest use. And the combination of tax reductions and deregulation, which I'll talk about later, those two things actually led to the healthy economy that I talked about earlier. Do I have any time left?
You can go another 20 seconds.
Well, the other 20 seconds, I want to talk about Caroline's growth figures. It's fairly easy to grow an economy when it comes right out of a recession, which is what President Biden did. As you get farther and farther down, as unemployment gets lower and lower, it becomes harder and harder to continually decrease unemployment. No one expected the Fed's lowest prediction was 4.5% for unemployment. No one predicted the level of unemployment, for example, would be as low as 3.5%, which is what President Trump had achieved just before the virus. And so that graph is a little not deceptive. It's true, but you have to recognize that Trump was adding to what was already a relatively low unemployment, and he made it much, much lower.
Thank you, Professor Rubin. Professor Fohlin, would you like to take a minute to respond?
Well, just briefly, because my next question is actually on the tax plan, but 2 points that Professor Rubin made were that prices would be higher because of corporate taxes increasing, I believe he said, and this is a common talking point, but in fact, to the extent that prices are set in competitive markets, of course, they aren't going to be higher because of corporate taxes. They're set by, supply and demand in a competitive market. So to the extent that markets are not competitive, well, then we have a problem with monopoly power, and that maybe there's market imperfections that would call for some kind of government involvement, because there must be a market failure at play if we have market power being evidenced in rising prices, which I doubt Professor Rubin would agree with implementing, that is government involvement, to offset monopoly power. So that's one main point. And then on share buybacks, the point he made was that he said exactly that corporations found that they're returning the capital to investors was the highest return use on that capital. And that's precisely the opposite of what the plan stated. The intention of reducing corporate taxes was, the stated claim was that it would allow more cash flow to corporations to invest in new productivity enhancing investments. And that productivity enhancement would actually raise workers' real wages. And, you'll be asking me the next question, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But I just wanted to point out that that directly contradicts the stated aim of the tax cut, which was to enhance corporate investment.
Can I make a real quick point? Yes, I will.
20 seconds for rebuttal.
To say that prices are set by supply and demand, that's quite right. But when there's a tax reduction, supply curves or demand curves shift. The tax is paid by everyone. So if there's a tax decrease or increase, then the supply curve will shift. So that will change prices.
Do you want to respond to that in 10 seconds, Professor?
Well, I mean, you can draw the supply and demand curves, but part of the problem is that the wealthiest get the benefits from those tax cuts, and about 45%, I think, almost half the population doesn't actually invest in stocks, even through 401ks, because you have to have a job that has a retirement plan in order to be invested in a 401k. And we have fewer and fewer of those kinds of good jobs with good retirement benefits, especially young people today and the gig economy. So that doesn't actually flow to them. And the people who actually consume most of the benefits to tax cuts are poor people, because of course they have the lowest disposable income and the greatest amount of pent up demand for goods. So a tax cut to poor people actually stimulates the economy much more, because it increases consumer spending, which is the biggest driver of our economy.
Okay, thank you. You anticipated the next question. You can elaborate therein. So this one's for Professor Fohlin. Vice President Biden has suggested repealing or revising President Trump's tax cuts and introducing new taxes to the tune of several $1 trillion in revenue For example, he has suggested increasing the corporate tax from 21 to 28%. What do you think will be the contractionary impact of such policy, especially during a COVID-induced recession? 2 minutes uninterrupted to Professor Fohlin.
Okay. So as we pointed out, the vast majority of the Trump tax cuts in 2017 benefited wealthy individuals and corporations. It failed to end and actually added many tax loopholes. It also cut taxes on the country's wealthiest heirs through the inheritance tax increase, that is the level on inheritance taxes that people could deduct. At the same time, it actually raised taxes on over 10 million families. It eliminated deductions for state and local taxes, so people now get taxed twice on whatever they pay in state and local taxes. That rule especially hurts families that pay high property taxes or state income taxes, but who do not earn incomes over $400,000 individually or $800,000 as a family, and thereby are not able to offset the tax increase, the double taxation tax increase, with big cuts to their top marginal tax rates. On the corporate side, corporations used most of their tax cuts to buy back their own stock, which we've just discussed, and that benefited shareholders, which I just mentioned represent maybe half or a little more half of the US population. And notably, about a third of the stock market is owned by foreigners, not Americans at all. So they got those benefits. They did not invest the proceeds to invest in new technology and improve labor productivity. Overall, the Trump tax plan didn't increase GDP growth or consumer spending. That's because the beneficiaries of the cuts were already wealthy and already able to buy pretty much everything they wanted to before the tax cuts. The cuts to top marginal tax rates and to taxes on huge inheritances increased wealth inequality in the country. And well over half of Americans, when polled, say that income and wealth inequality is too extreme in the US right now. And that is even some Republicans. The Biden tax plan makes the tax code more progressive. It cuts taxes on lower and middle income taxpayers while reinstating the previous top marginal tax rate on the top few percent of households. That is, individuals who earn over $400,000 or $800,000 as a family. That's not very many Americans. It will also return statutory corporate rates halfway back to their pre-2017 levels. In other words, representing a significant tax cut over pre-2017 levels. And again, corporations don't usually pay the statutory tax rate. In fact, dozens of them pay no taxes at all, and hundreds pay under of the Fortune 500 companies pay under 5% tax. So you have to keep in mind the effective tax rate versus statutory tax rates.
That's 2 minutes.
Okay, can I just finish my last?
Yes, finish your last point.
Since the tax cuts did little or nothing to spur investment or economic growth, the partial reversal of those cuts can be expected to cause little disruption to corporate investment plans and should actually increase consumer spending. The majority of US economic activity derives from consumer spending. So giving low and middle income people more disposable income will spur economic growth.
Paul, do you want to respond?
Yeah, does someone have my graph, my table?
Elizabeth, can you put up Professor Rubin's graph? Thank you.
All right, so this is a result of a paper done by several economists at Stanford University at the Hoover Institution, and it's not just it's a model of the effects of not just the taxes. So I may use this again, but the effect of the regulation, taxes, and spending on the economy, and it's assuming that President Biden would eliminate the Trump administration reduced a lot of regulation. The assumption is that that'll come back, and he's using Biden's claim for taxes and for spending, including spending on Green New Deal and environmental spending and all, and taxes on fracking and so forth. And what it shows is that relative to what the Congressional Budget Office is projecting for 2030, there'll be a reduction in employment per person, reduction in capital stock, reduction in GDP, reduction in consumption, and I've highlighted the most important number, I believe, which is $6,500. Median household income will be reduced by $6,500 if we were to adopt the economic program of the Biden administration. That's because incentives created or reduced by the various policies. And it's a pretty careful study. It's available online at Hoover Institution. And in it, they've used standard economic estimates of various elasticities of labor and of capital investment. And net result, the general equilibrium result of all of these policies is a reduction in median household income of $6,500.
Thank you, Paul. The next question is also for you. What is the optimal balance between COVID-related health concerns, which lead to pressure to close the economy, and economic concerns, which lead to pressure to open it? And has President Trump's approach to the pandemic come close to the optimal balance? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
I don't know the answer to that. There's been some efforts at cost-benefit analysis of various programs, but they're really very, very preliminary. So we're sort of guessing here. I think everyone is sort of guessing. And we had a guess at the beginning as well. We didn't know what policies were optimal. We've learned more about the virus. For example, we didn't know, or at least several Democratic governors, Cuomo of New York, Murphy of New Jersey, several others, put sick people who were suffering from COVID into nursing homes, required nursing homes to accept such people. And the best estimates are that some thousands of people died because of that policy. At that time, maybe they didn't know that the elderly, such as myself, were more susceptible to COVID than others. Since that's true, since the elderly seem to be more susceptible, that says we can open up the economy a bit more than we otherwise could. Students seem not to be susceptible, young people, and so we can, if we open the economy a bit, elderly people can basically we can protect ourselves by various precautions, wearing masks, not using online shopping if we can for grocery stores. My wife and I like to eat out, but we only go to restaurants where we can sit outside. We never go inside. So there are various methods of protecting yourself that the elderly can use. And for the other people, for younger people, opening up the economy. Some people may be more risk averse and may prefer avoiding crowds and so forth. Other people don't, and that's a choice. But I don't know the optimal level. I don't know what the trade-off is. I will say 200 and some thousand people have died from COVID, and I worked at the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and we learned to say every death is tragic, and that is very sad. 200,000 people dead is a lot. On the other hand, we have to realize that every year almost 3 million people die in the US, so it's not like it's a huge increase in death rates. It's a sad thing. It's something we want to try to avoid. But again, economists know that there's a trade-off, that there is an amount people are willing to spend to avoid death and to avoid injury. And we don't know how that affects it's affected through the COVID thing. So I don't think I know the answer. I don't know that President Biden knows the answer either, although he seems more willing to close the economy down than what President Trump would. President Trump seems more willing to open the economy than would Biden presidency.
Thank you. Professor Rubin, we can hear you better when you're facing the microphone. When you turn away, we can't hear you as well.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Question for Professor Fohlin. What is the optimal balance between COVID-related health and economic concerns? And how different would the Biden approach to the pandemic be from the Trump approach? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
Okay. So the great news is Joe Biden believes that we don't have to choose between public health and the economy. Economic recovery hinges critically on public health. The reason the economy continues to suffer is that the pandemic continues to rage and is in fact getting worse. That's because the Trump administration did not listen to scientists and medical experts about how best to control the pandemic and has taken insufficient steps to make it safe to fully reopen the economy. Other countries have done much better, and their economies and people have suffered far less than the US has. In fact, shutting down early and more completely would have allowed us to reopen more fully and sooner. Joe Biden's #1 priority is to get the pandemic under control in order to make it safe for children to return to school, college students and faculty to return to campus, and for everyone else to get back to business as usual. Millions of parents, and especially moms, I would like to highlight, have had to quit their jobs or reduce hours in order to care for and teach their children who cannot attend school in person or daycare. Since the start of the pandemic, virtually all economists have been imploring the Trump administration to take the necessary steps to control the pandemic and thereby accelerate the reopening of the economy. That would include things like providing fast, accurate, and cheap testing on a mass scale, isolate positive people and trace their contacts for quarantine. We see breaches of that protocol right now in the Trump administration, including the vice president. Marshal federal resources and buying power to provide all necessary PPE and medical equipment. Institute non-medical strategies nationwide, like mask wearing and social distancing. Historical research on the 1918 pandemic demonstrates that the economies in cities that instated non-medical interventions actually recovered more quickly than those that refused them. Let's learn from that history. Joe Biden also understands that herd immunity is virtually unattainable, and its pursuit will kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans. It is indeed a dangerous and unethical policy, and it will drive most people back into self-isolation and actually worsen the economic recession. Did I get a response to, do I get to respond to Professor Rubin's? You're muted.
You haven't taken all your time, so you can take 20
Oh, okay.
seconds.
I just wanted to say, on behalf, a couple of points. The idea that it's safe to put children back in school is not really valid, because children live with adults, and sometimes quite old adults, like my 6th grader, who is not in school because he is a 6th grader at Atlanta Public Schools, which is now closed for virtual learning, for in-person learning. So he does virtual learning. If he were to go to school, he would be coming home every day and interacting very closely with my husband and myself, and with my husband's dad, who lives right up the street, who's 85 years old. So it's not safe to say, and also teachers who have to go and teach in person, some of them are quite old, even older than I am, maybe as old as Professor Rubin. And they would have to interact with these little super spreader germ factories. And you know how it is, even under normal disease circumstances, when the kids come home, they're like little petri dishes, right? They bring everything home with them. So we would all get it and spread it around. So,
Professor Rubin, do you want to respond to that in 20 seconds?
Well, a couple of things. I've been told that the schools have now set up screens so that the teachers in lower schools themselves are protected by the screens. I'm sorry for your father-in-law who lives down the street, but we haven't seen our grandchildren since this thing started, and he could also not see his, even though he could wave at them through the window, but not see them. The other thing is, it's not clear that as the administration was fighting these things, Biden was taking proposed policies. In many cases, Trump did follow the advice of the experts at the beginning. For example, they said, don't wear masks. And then they changed and said, wear masks. Trump very quickly closed the border to China and then to Europe. And Vice President Biden immediately called that xenophobic and stupid. And Dr. Fauci, who disagrees with Trump on some things, has nonetheless said that that policy saved hundreds of thousands of, a huge number of lives. And at the time that Trump did it, Biden was saying, this is a stupid thing to do. We shouldn't do this. It's just Trump. So to say that in hindsight, Trump maybe could have done some things differently, but as I said, we're learning a lot about the virus as time goes on, things that we did not know when it first started spreading, and say, well, we should have done something differently. It's not so clear. It wasn't so clear that we knew what to do differently at that time.
well, can I just make
Do
one?
you want to get 10 seconds to respond? We have a number of questions to get to after.
Yeah, I
that.
just wanted to point out that that's very true, that early on we knew nothing about this, and we were all learning every day something new, and it was very scary and fast moving. But the fact is that we now know that they were not willing to marshal the resources of the federal government to use the monopsony power of the federal government to buy all the PPE that was needed and ventilators and so on, leaving it to the states to create bidding wars with each other, which is awful. And still to this day, you and I cannot go to the store and buy an N95 mask, which is unconscionable. But the other thing is, what?
Another 10 seconds.
They continue to run around the country holding giant super spreader rallies with no masks, no social distancing, not wearing masks themselves. And Trump himself got the coronavirus because he didn't follow the proper protocols. And it's
Okay.
The White House is a hotspot, and they're running the Corona garden parties.
Okay.
And it's just,
We need to move on.
A better policy would have been for Trump to stay in his basement.
yes.
Okay.
Well,
We really need to move on now. Okay. The next question is for Professor Rubin. Several economists on either side of the ideological spectrum have criticized the first rescue package, the CARES Act, for first providing recipients with wrong incentives, like not to go back to work or stay closed, and second, to disproportionately help large corporations rather than small businesses. How do you respond to these criticisms?
They may well be true. I'm not an expert on the plan. I do know that I did look. It was passed almost unanimously by both houses of Congress, and I wasn't able to find any evidence that President Trump had any particular involvement in designing the plan. It was a hurry. Tried to pass it very quickly. Government never gets, I would say, anything, but I think Caroline would agree, at least it doesn't get everything right. And it's not surprising that there would be some errors in this plan. So that's all I can say. I really don't think it's something we can blame President Trump for, because I don't think he wanted a plan. He was eager to get a plan passed, and the plan was passed, but I don't think he was heavily involved in designing the plan. And of course, we haven't, because of the Democrats in Congress, we haven't been able to pass another plan. We're now stymied till at least after the election, even though President Trump was trying to get another plan passed.
Okay, Professor Fohlin, do you want to take a minute to respond?
Yeah, I'll just say I agree that absolutely that the governments don't get everything right ever. You can be sure about that. But usually when they make errors, it is they err on the side of large corporations, and large corporations did benefit. And so there need to be more stringent requirements on these funds so that they don't go to large corporations that have plenty of reserves. That's what your reserves are supposed to be there for. And they only go to preserving payrolls, which is what several other countries did. But the other thing is, I think that, and maybe Professor Rubin would agree, that the stimulus payments also went to too many people who make too much money. So you could be earning a family income of $200,000, which is just hugely over the median family income in this country, and still get a stimulus payment, especially if you had children. So, and if you made $150,000 family income and had 4 children, you would be getting like almost $5,000. And so it's no wonder that people polled said that about 36% was saved, and another 35% was used to pay down debts, like people paid down their mortgages early or something. So more stimulative effect would have been felt if they had taken the level down to people, earning under the median income at least.
Well, thank you. The minute is up and you have time to elaborate. In the next question for Professor Fohlin, what would Vice President Biden's recovery stimulus package look like, and how would it mitigate and remediate disproportionate impact of the pandemic on the more economically vulnerable segment of the population? You have 2 minutes.
Okay, so if the current conditions continue until January, which in all likelihood they will, a Biden administration would provide additional stimulus checks to those in lower income brackets, And as I just said, not stipulated in his plan, though, online that I could find, I would say they should go to lower income, even lower income individuals. That's a bit of a political trade-off. On his plan would be to forgive a minimum of $10,000 per person in federal student loans, increase monthly Social Security checks by $200. So seniors would be getting, and disabled people would be getting $200 a month extras to do that home shopping, I guess. Provide emergency paid sick leave to everybody who needs it, with nobody excluded. That would include workers in all industries and sectors, regardless of company size. So that means gig workers are included, domestic workers are included, contractors, and self-employed. He would ensure that no one has to pay any out-of-pocket expenses for COVID-19 testing, treatment, or eventually a vaccine. He would provide all necessary fiscal relief to states so that their workers and communities get the help they need. I don't know if viewers know this, but states have to balance their budgets. The federal government does not. So a state that's hit particularly hard by the pandemic may be unable to actually expend or pay for the resources it would need at the state level. It would actually require federal help to do that. Mitch McConnell has actually gone on record saying, let them go bankrupt, who cares? Joe Biden
20 seconds.
Joe Biden would also expedite aid to businesses who commit to helping workers stay employed through the crisis so they can get back to work when conditions allow. At the same time, he would enforce strict limits on the use of funds, as I mentioned earlier, such that large corporations could not use funds for share buybacks or executive compensation.
Thank you. Paul, you want to take a minute to respond?
Sounds like a good plan, but again, sounds like a fairly expensive plan. It's not clear that all of that money needs to be spent in those ways. The other thing is, well, that's, and the other thing is, it's a very detailed plan, which is consistent with Democrats and Vice President Biden's view to micromanage things and control things in a very detailed level, as opposed to a plan which would provide more funds, but not have so many restrictions on the way that they must be spent.
Okay, next question is for you, Professor Rubin. President Trump's environmental policies, leading to more emphasis on fossil fuel, pulling out of the Paris Accord, and relaxing anti-pollution mandates, are criticized by environmental groups who argue that another 4 years of such policies will do irreparable damage to our ecosystem. How do you respond to these How do you respond to these charges? You have 2 minutes.
Well, one of Trump's major policies was to allow fracking, and fracking led to use of natural gas, and that natural gas is much less polluting than coal or oil. And in fact, our country has done much better than countries that remained in the Paris Accords. We've actually reduced pollution quite substantially because we've relied on natural gas and on fracking. It's not clear what Vice President Biden's policies are on fracking, but he doesn't seem to like it. He may not ban it, although he's banning it on federal lands, which is 22%. And there's a very good chance that if he doesn't ban it, he or Vice President Harris will regulate it and essentially kill it by regulating it. Fracking is not a long-term solution, although there is really only one long-term solution to pollution, and that's nuclear power. Anything else is just a stopgap. I'm not a big things like windmills we're now having trouble with because they're wearing out, and you've got these big, huge blades that have to be thrown away somewhere, hard to get rid of. Take a lot of power to create the windmill in the first place, and a lot of power to get rid of them. The same thing with solar. Solars are right on your roof if you live in a sunny area, perhaps. But huge solar things are very, 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 very space consuming as compared to a nuclear reactor. It's also, you also need backup. Solar power only works when the sun is shining. Wind power only works when the wind is blowing. You need either very expensive power consuming batteries or some other method of backing them up. So I probably would go farther than most. I don't think those policies are very useful. I think we could rely short term on natural gas and in the long term and try to develop, we have developed and continue to use nuclear power, which doesn't take much space, can be much cheaper than these other things once we get it going, and is totally non-polluting. So that would be the solution I would use. And these other things are expensive. Again, go back to my number, $6,500 per family.
We're over 2 minutes.
And what Trump has done is not that expensive.
Professor Fohlin, 1 minute to respond.
Yes, of course, I'm going to be addressing the same topic in a moment, but just in response.
Well, we can move to the next topic if you'd like.
No, I actually want to respond to that because I didn't bring up, in my response, I haven't brought up nuclear power because Professor Rubin is correct. It is very clean when it's working properly. And, you know, I actually think it's a good idea. But the problem is when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. You know, so has anyone watched Chernobyl? I haven't watched it yet because I'm kind of scared, but it's supposed to be an excellent documentary on Chernobyl disaster. But really the main point is that the Trump administration has done nothing, as far as I have read, to promote, and they don't plan to promote nuclear energy. What they've done is opened up, you know, they've opened up more drilling and fracking, which does cause environmental degradation. It's cleaner. It actually does reduce carbon over certain other kinds of energy production, but at the same time, it actually causes earthquakes and other kinds of water pollution, other kinds of environmental degradation. So it's not great. It's maybe a little better on the carbon front.
Let's move ahead.
But again, nuclear power is not part of nuclear power is not part of the Trump plan. So that's a little bit of a red herring.
So let's move ahead. We have only 14 minutes.
Real quick. When I went online, that Trump has passed some bills that support nuclear power. So I don't think that's correct to say that he's not in favor of it. Chernobyl has an important lesson for all of us. The lesson is don't let communists build your nuclear plants.
Yeah. Let's move on. We have
with that.
quite a few questions to get to, and the hour is almost up. Professor Fohlin, Vice President Biden has stated some opposition to the use of fossil fuels, especially coal and fracking, and support for the Green New Deal. His environmental plan calls for achieving 100% clean energy and net zero emissions by 2050. What are the economic costs of such policies? Do you think such policies can cost jobs, and what remedies in terms of substitution with green jobs can be offered? You have 2 minutes, and I'll take the time.
So that's a great question. Joe Biden actually recognizes that the green energy revolution offers a huge opportunity to spur economic growth in this country and create high-paying jobs for American workers. So remember Infrastructure Week? That never happened. Well, Joe Biden would actually do it and would do it better. Rebuilding America's infrastructure while incentivizing innovation and investments in green technology. You know, we stand at a historical inflection point, really at the beginning of a new industrial revolution. And history shows that industrial revolutions create countless new jobs, but the process does displace workers out of old and into new industries. And that can be very scary. A Biden administration would ease the disruption by helping to retrain the existing workforce and to educate future generations of workers to prosper in the years ahead. According to a recent Georgia Tech analysis, right here in Atlanta, energy efficiency investments alone would create at least twice as many jobs as it would eliminate. 1.8 million new jobs in 2030, that's just 10 years from now, and 4.2 million jobs in 2050. One way to speed the transition to clean energy is a simple carbon tax. Those researchers also estimated that a $25 carbon tax just on electricity generation alone would bring in $35 billion in 2020. A $60 tax would yield $68 billion. The resulting tax rebates to individuals would exceed the increases in utility costs. So that would be a net win for Americans. Despite the ongoing destruction of the environment, the Trump administration subsidizes fossil fuel industries. I don't know if you knew that, and continues to roll back crucial environmental protections, expanding drilling for oil and gas on federal lands and offshore, including even the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. While the Trump administration prioritizes short-term profits of political donors over long-term economic growth and the health and well-being of all Americans, the Biden plan will protect the environment and rebuild the economy for our children and for future generations.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Rubin, do you want to take 45 seconds to respond?
Yeah, so first of all, of course, the Green New Deal and other things are part of the $6,500 that's been estimated to cost families, so it's not cheap to do that. Secondly, you can talk about a carbon tax, and most economists agree that a carbon tax is a useful thing. But as I understand the Green New Deal, I don't know if a carbon tax is part of it, but a huge amount of it goes to things like rebuilding houses, buildings to make them more energy efficient. Presumably, if there's a correct carbon tax, you don't need to spend that money. But again, the Green New Deal is back to the detailed control of the economy rather than simply saying we'll pass a carbon tax and let it go at that. Also, jobs themselves are not good. To say it creates jobs is not, as we economists know, a job is a cost. Someone is spending time doing something. If we could get things with fewer jobs, then we'd be better off. People could do more productive things. So people are spending their time refitting old buildings at an excessive cost, then that's a cost, not a benefit, unless it really pays to refit the building. And if it does, then the owners of the building should do it if there were an additional carbon tax.
Thank you. Professor Rubin, in your view, what are the real impacts of President Trump's tariffs and trade frictions with China on the global standing of the United States?
I'm not a big fan of tariffs, even though I generally like President Trump's policies, but most economists are not fans of tariffs, including President Trump's own Council of Economic Advisors. They did not say much about tariffs, about his various tariff programs. He does have one economist there who's in favor of tariffs, but most economists, including his own council, are not. Trade war with China did cost the U.S. money. It also cost China somewhat more money, but it was in that sense inefficient. It did apparently lead to some additional protection of U.S. intellectual property by the Chinese. They routinely violate intellectual property rules. And there was some increase, but it wasn't a very big one, as I understand. U.S.-China relations, though, are much more than trade. We're now really in it's really very non-economic strategic considerations, which we have to consider when we're talking about policy with respect to China. And what I read about Vice President Biden's policies, it doesn't seem he would change them much, although some recent information about his relationship with China might lead to think that he would take different policies, at least with respect to the strategic element. But I would not defend the tariff, the trade war.
Professor Fohlin, you want to take 30 seconds to respond?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hardly have to respond because I think Professor Rubin and I pretty much agree that we should be endeavoring to have more free trade and not try to fight trade wars because, as it turns out, trade wars are not easy to win. It's important for viewers to understand that tariffs are a tax, and those taxes primarily hit American consumers. And they also cause retaliation. As I mentioned before, those tariffs at the beginning, I mentioned this, the Trump administration imposing tariffs on China, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. So other countries, China in particular, impose retaliatory tariffs against American products, and it goes back and forth, right? So it actually can spiral into really unreasonable levels, which we've seen. And as I said, it's cost tens of billions of dollars to American consumers and companies. So it's been a net loss, and it has not improved our trade balance in goods.
So we have some agreement on trade. Let's move on to the next question for Professor Fohlin. What is Vice President Biden's healthcare plan in terms of coverage and costs? You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Of course, it's one of the most important issues for most American voters. And I will start by saying that Joe Biden believes that every American deserves affordable, high-quality health care. Biden's plan will do 3 things: expand coverage, improve coverage, and lower healthcare costs. Unlike every other industrialized nation in the world, the United States insurance system leaves tens of millions uninsured or underinsured. The Affordable Care Act put forth and passed under the Obama-Biden administration improved the situation dramatically, providing health insurance to over 20 million Americans in just the first 5 years. Joe Biden's plan will significantly expand coverage to millions more who remain uninsured and will expand the available options via an affordable public option. Republican-controlled states, it's important to understand, including Georgia, largely chose not to expand Medicaid and thereby turned down billions of dollars of federal funding, leaving low-income individuals uninsured in those states and also without access to the subsidies provided to low-income earners via the marketplace. Joe Biden's plan will fix this gap with the new public option. Second, Joe Biden will improve coverage, reinforcing the ACA's coverage and crucial patient protections. These plans have the protections of standardized benefits and no pre-existing condition exclusions. The ACA allows parents to keep their children on their insurance until they're 26 years old. That rule is a lifesaver for millions of young adults with poor access to their own affordable, high-quality health insurance. The Trump administration has allowed new junk plans, that is, short-term plans that often contain pre-existing condition exclusions, tight limits on benefits, and widespread rejection of patients.
20 seconds.
These Trump plans are the same as the junk plans offered before the ACA. Number 3, Joe Biden will lower healthcare costs. Our current health insurance system lacks competitive forces and suffers from critical market failures. By creating an affordable public option, the Biden plan creates market competition to lower insurance rate. The Biden plan contrasts sharply with the Trump plan. The Trump administration has had nearly 4 years to produce the something great he promised to replace the ACA. The truth is that what they want to do is cut Social Security and Medicare, and right now fighting to end the ACA altogether. In just 2 weeks, the Supreme Court will hear California v. Texas case in which the Trump administration would end all of the ACA's patient protections, including for pre-existing conditions and for young adults on their parents' plans. It will also end affordable health care to the neediest populations.
Okay, thank you. That was 3 minutes. Professor Rubin?
It was so important, though, and I wish it on other topics.
So we've heard this song before when President Obama said, if you like your health plan, you can keep your health plan, and we quickly learned that that was just simply not true. We're economists, so we know that it's very hard to get a free lunch, and yet Professor Fohlin has just described a free lunch. It's more medical care for more people, better medical care, and cheaper medical care. Hard to see how we're going to get those things overall, and I don't see it actually. Most people, 180 or 90 million people in America, are quite happy with their health insurance. And it's hard to say it's not competitive. I'm an old guy, so I'm on Medicare, and this is the time of year it's called open season, and every day you throw away about 40 pieces of mail from different companies offering to provide the supplementary insurance to Medicare, and when Emory or any other employer finds an insurance plan, they don't just say, well, we'll take the first one that walks in off the door. They do a lot of careful shopping between all the different health insurance companies. So to say that there's no competition seems to me to be just no. I don't see any way you can see that. There are a lot of problems with medicine, but lack of competition in insurance doesn't seem to be one of them. And there was and then talk about a public option. Most people think that if there's a public option, it will simply gobble up all private insurance, because the government can compete better than a private company because it has access to tax revenue. So unless it's a very carefully designed plan, we'll end up with a single payer. And since it's pretty clear that the Democratic Party has long wanted a single payer plan, they will simply use the public option, kill off private insurance, and end up with a single payer.
Thank you. We have to move on. We have 2 last questions. Professor Deshbash, did you want to say something? No? Okay, so no time for rebuttal on the last 2 questions. Professor Rubin, has President Trump's emphasis on deregulation harmed the health and safety of Americans?
There's an interesting book that just came out by Casey Mulligan, who was a Chicago economist, who was a very important figure in the deregulation movement of the Trump administration. But most deregulation is economic. Most of the most regulation and most deregulation is economic, and most of the Trump deregulatory plans have reduced the economic regulation or the special interest regulation, which we all know as economists is very, 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 very common. Most regulations are highly detailed, technical, and they're difficult to read and figure out. This may be, in fact, when Obamacare was being discussed, Professor Gruber from MIT said that we had to lie about them or make them incomprehensible. And no one wants to read those things. When I was a consultant, I would sometimes read them, but only if somebody paid me very generously to spend my time doing so. But if we put them back, and many are also paternalistic. And we're hearing that again and again when what are called junk plans are plans that some people prefer for whatever reason. Some people want a short-term plan that will cover some things and not others. And if we say we're outlawing junk plans, then we're being paternalistic again. We're saying we know better than people what they should buy, and we're going to control the market, not let them buy those plans. So it's part of the general democratic view that we should control people's behavior. They don't know what they're doing themselves, and we want very detailed controls, which we've seen with several of Caroline's comments.
Okay, we need to move on. We're past the hour.
Let me just say one thing. The estimate is that the Trump deregulation has increased household income by about $4,000 per year compared to the path of the Bush-Obama administration.
Thank you. Last question, closing question to Professor Fohlin.
Yeah.
Does Vice President Biden's economic plan suggest a change in the capital gains tax, and what will be the impact of any such change on the stock market and the economy? You have 1 minute.
Okay, first of all, I want to know where I pick up my check for the $4,000 from the deregulation dividend. But on capital gains tax, the stock market, you mean probably the appreciation of stock indexes such as the Dow or S&P 500, which provide an average of stock prices of large US corporations. In a freely functioning market, stock prices represent, roughly speaking, the present discounted value of all future cash flows to corporations. Thus, the rate of taxation of those prices doesn't affect the value of stocks at equilibrium, except for in certain conditions. The suggested increase in capital gains taxes apply only to the top income brackets, so I would expect little impact on the economy. I expect more tax avoidance, charitable giving of appreciated stock, and passing on stock to heirs, because remarkably, the inherited shares get a reset to current market value, thus allowing the heir to avoid paying any taxes at all on even wildly appreciated capital gains shares. It's worth noting that capital gains represent returns on capital inputs, which is the parallel to wages as the gains to labor inputs. So one wonders, why should workers pay higher tax rates on their marginal return to labor inputs than wealthy or high income capital owners pay on returns to their capital?
Thank you. We have to end it here. Professor Fohlin, Professor Rubin, it's been an interesting and enlightening hour. I want to thank you both for participating in this debate. Now the decision is up to you, the people in our audience and beyond. While millions have already voted, Election Day, November 3rd, is only 8 days away. And one thing everybody here can agree on is we hope that you will vote. Thank you and good night.
And vote early.
And often. Early and often.
No, not often, just once, but do it early.
Thank you, and stay tuned for other events organized by Economics Department. We have an exciting plan for a spring semester also with a similar plan, but a similar event, but focusing on other important issues of our time. Thank you all.